Welcome to the deep dive. I want you to try and imagine something with me. You're in the Middle Ages, maybe you're out in the fields or you're in a workshop hammering away, and then you feel it. The air changes, the sun starts to dip, and you suddenly have this absolute non-negotiable deadline. We're not talking about just getting home before traffic. We're talking about a complete sensory plunge into a reality that almost none of us have ever really experienced. The absolute light-starved world of the medieval night. We've got a fantastic stack of historical transcripts and notes for this one. Our mission is to really get a deep, functional, almost physical understanding of how life, society, and even the human mind itself had to restructure on the complete absence of guaranteed artificial light. Because darkness wasn't just a pause button, was it? It was this demanding, active condition that stole everything. Time, safety, certainty.
It's probably the single most overlooked fact of pre-industrial life. We're so trained now to think of light as this infinite resource. You flip a switch. But in the Middle Ages, that idea was just impossible. Daylight was the only resource that mattered, and it governed everything. When the sun disappeared, the world didn't just get dark, it physically contracted. And the adaptations people had to make, both physical and mental, just to exist after sunset were incredibly intense. We're going to get into just how deep that went, from the architecture of their homes right down to the rhythm of their sleep.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with that urgent sensory shift, the moment the sun began to fade. The sources all seem to agree on this one point. The moment the sun started its final descent, life just accelerated. It wasn't a calm transition into evening. It was a scramble.
It was a routine scramble, but a scramble nonetheless. It's not, not a way we'd think of it. It was just demanding. Think about the tension. Their whole day was built around sunlight. The schedule literally stretched in the summer and then shrank so painfully in the winter. So nightfall wasn't just the end of the day. It was the hard deadline for safety, for work, for movement. Everything stopped.
So what did that look like on the ground? What are the mechanics of that urgency? What are people actually doing in those last few minutes of light?
You see this mix of coordinated but chaotic activity. Farmers are rushing to get their livestock into enclosures, double-checking fences one last time. The blacksmith is getting in that final hammer blow. The weaver is tying that last knot. If they stop before the light is totally gone, that's productivity they just can't get back cheaply. So footsteps get faster, voices get sharper. Not angry, but urgent. Are you in? Is the door secured? It's all about getting everyone accounted for before the world outside just vanishes.
I really want to focus on that sensory aspect. We have clocks, phones, all these abstract things telling us time is passing. For them, time was passing because their most important sense was actively failing. What does that feel like in the body?
It's a physiological event, not just an idea. Your body feels it before your mind even processes the danger. The very first thing to go is color. Those bright reds, the yellows, they just flatten out. The world becomes this muted palette of greens and browns. It's because the cones in your eyes, the things that process color and detail, they start working reliably in low light. You start to rely on your rods.
And rods are for motion, not detail, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Great for seeing a flicker of movement, terrible for identifying what that movement is. So what does that mean? It means faces blur at a distance of just a few feet. Familiar trees or buildings lose their depth and become flat silhouettes. And crucially, your peripheral vision, the thing that keeps you aware and safe, it becomes completely unreliable. You might see a shape move on the edge of your vision, but you have no idea what it is, how fast it's moving.
So the world literally narrows.
It narrows down to what's right in front of your feet, the path, the doorstep. Everything else is a gray zone of guesswork. And that kind of caution is physically draining.
Which brings up a big scholarly debate. Was all this urgency driven by a simple practical caution? I don't want to trip over a root. Or was it a genuine, deep-seated fear of the dark itself?
And that's the core of it, really. It's too simple to just say they were terrified. A lot of historians argue that they just respected the darkness, the way a sailor respects the ocean. It's a powerful force that demands caution, not necessarily courage. But then you look at other sources, religious texts, legal records, and you see a clear anxiety about what the darkness hid.
So it wasn't the absence of light.
It was the presence of uncertainty. The dark was where chaos lived. It's where the lawless were, the supernatural. When you look at the prayers people said before traveling at night, or just their reluctance to even step outside alone, you realize it's all layered. You've got the physical threat, the thief, the wolf, piled on top of this deep cultural unease. So you respected the physical reality, sure, but you also feared the possibilities the darkness created.
So once that last bit of useful sunlight is gone, you're left with the sky, the stars, The moon. To us, that's romantic, but did it offer any real help to someone trying to get home?
It offered a lot of beauty, but very little practical help for moving on the ground. I mean, yes, if you're a sailor, you can navigate by the stars. But if you're just trying to walk across a muddy village path full of ruts, the starlight is way too diffuse, too distant. It's not enough to show you where you're putting your feet.
And moonlight. We always think of a full moon as this big, bright lamp. You're saying it was more deceptive than helpful.
Precisely. A bright full moon doesn't illuminate things clearly. It silvers everything. It smooths over textures, so you can't tell the difference between a puddle and solid ground. And worse, it creates these long, deep, moving shadows. A cloud passes overhead, and the shadow of fence posts suddenly stretches and moves. Your eyes play tricks on you. Was that a person in your periphery or just a shadow? You can never be certain about anything.
So if the outside world becomes pure guesswork, the only logical response is a total retreat.
Exactly. It's instinctual. Everyone goes inside, immediately. The medieval night is overwhelmingly an indoor life. The darkness feels like this physical weight pressing on the walls of the house, and your only defense is to be inside them. And this is where their architecture becomes so important. These houses weren't built to look pretty or frame a view. They were built to survive. The thick walls, the tiny openings, they were all defensive choices against cold, wind, and the darkness itself.
And that transition must have been so jarring. You go from the confusing dimness outside to what must be near total blackness inside, where your only guide is memory.
It's a complete sensory shock. Even on a bright day, a medieval home was dim. When the sun set, the inside became this pocket of absolute black. Your eyes are straining, just desperately trying to find an edge, a shape, anything. You're shuffling your feet, guided only by where you think the table is, praying you don't step on the dog or kick over a tool. You're forced to rely completely on your sense of where your body is in space, which is incredibly taxing.
And that desperation, that fear of the interior void, that's why everything, the entire evening, revolved around one single thing, fire.
That first flicker of the hearth fire is, without a doubt, the most important moment of the medieval evening. It's the moment the room comes back into being, even if only partially. The hearth was the anchor of everything. Light, warmth, protection, cooking, it was all in one place.
We all know the hearth was central. That's a common image.
Right.
But what about the psychological reality of relying on that one single source? The mental energy just to maintain it must have been huge.
It's a constant mental tax. On one hand, the warmth is this incredible physical release. It loosens all the tension of the day. But on the other hand, the fire is also the single greatest threat inside the home. It's this source of immense comfort that is always, always threatening total catastrophe. I mean, think about it. Open hearths, often in the middle of a room, surrounded by straw on the floor, wooden furniture, cloth. The risk was constant.
So everyone is watching it, not just enjoying it, but actively monitoring it.
Everyone is watching the fire, vigilantly. Embers shift. Sparks can fly. A sudden gust of wind down the smoke hole could send ash everywhere. A single careless move, someone rolling over in their sleep, dropping something, could turn that refuge into a death trap in minutes, especially in a house with a thatched roof. That mental load of just managing that risk night after night is exhausting.
And we have to talk about the quality of the light and, of course, the smell. Fire doesn't light a room evenly. It creates a very specific kind of environment.
The light is alive, it's dynamic, it dances, it creates these little islands of warm, golden visibility right around the hearth. The walls flicker, faces seem to appear and disappear as people shift, and anything outside that immediate circle is thrown into this deep, impenetrable shadow. The ceiling, which is already black with soot, just vanishes. This kind of flickering light makes it hard to do any fine detail work, which is why it encouraged storytelling, not reading.
But the smell was the constant reality. And it wasn't the clean, romantic scent of a modern fireplace.
Not even close. This was the pervasive smell of damp wood, of old ash, and very often the smell of animal fat from cooking or from tallow candles. And the smoke clings to absolutely everything. Your hair, your clothes, the bedding. It gets into the very wood of the house. It's not just a nuisance. It's a constant strain on your respiratory system.
And some sources mention that when wood was scarce, they burned other things. I think there's a fringe detail about dried animal dung.
That's right. Especially in regions without many trees, where wood was just too valuable to burn freely. They'd burn dried animal dung or peat in some areas. It gave off heat, sure, but it produced this unforgettable, acrid, heavy smoke. It's the smell that gets into the food, into the walls, into the very fibers of who you are. Imagine that being the constant atmosphere of your home every single night. The air wasn't clean, it was dense and warm and just heavy with the smell of whatever fuel you could find.
Okay, so once the fire is lit, the food is eaten, everyone is settled, the whole pace of the evening seems to change. You describe it as time thickening.
Yes, because without the demands of work and without artificial light to keep you productive, the evening isn't something you fill with activities. It's something you sort of endure until it's time for sleep. This is something historians talk about a lot, this distortion of time. Did they really experience time as moving slower? Or is it just that our modern world is so accelerated, always checking a phone, always on a deadline, that their world just feels sluggish to us? But when you're sitting by that single low fire, time does feel heavy, almost like syrup. There's this enforced patience. You're just waiting for sleep, waiting for dawn. The only thing to do is quiet reflection or maybe mending something. It slows your internal clock right down.
And that quiet, thick time must have radically changed how people interacted with each other. The whole dynamic of sound would shift.
Oh, completely. Conversation becomes soft. You don't shout across a dimly lit room. Voices get lower. People murmur because sound doesn't travel as well without bright, hard surfaces to bounce off. There's also just a need to conserve energy, so the whole rhythm of speech slows down.
But while human sounds get quieter, your sense of hearing must become incredibly sharp to fill the void left by your eyes. What were they listening for?
They were listening for everything, the intentional, the natural, and the terrifying. The intentional sounds were things like distant church bells, marking the prayer hours, the only reliable timekeepers. The natural sounds were the constant noises of the house itself. Mice in the walls, the creak of rafters as the wood cools and settles, the sound of the wind trying to find a way in. Those sounds were reassuring in a way. They meant the house was still standing.
And the terrifying.
The terrifying was anything that didn't belong. A single footstep outside. A rustle in the thatch that sounds too big to be a mouse. Your mind becomes this intense processing unit, analyzing every single sound against a backdrop of total silence and darkness. You develop an almost animalistic awareness of sound.
And the sources say that communities actively discourage noise after dark. This wasn't just about being polite.
It was a critical form of group protection. The number one rule was, don't make noise. Because sound attracts attention, and attention invited trouble. Could be a thief, could be a wild animal. Quiet was a social contract. It was enforced by necessity. When you're relying totally on your hearing to know if you're safe, a sudden loud noise could mask a real danger and put everyone at risk. So people learned to move deliberately, to place their feet carefully. The darkness outside always felt like it was listening.
We've established the medieval house as a fortress against the night. Let's dig a bit deeper into how the architecture itself really defined that nightly experience.
The whole design philosophy was about endurance, enduring the pressure of the environment. Thick wall stone, packed earth, heavy timber-low ceilings, and very few openings. These were all choices made for survival, not for looks. Thermal efficiency and security were everything.
I'm curious about the windows. We often see these narrow slits in drawings from the period. The obvious reason is defense against intruders, but was there a more practical day-to-day purpose for that design?
Intruders were definitely a concern, yeah, but the more constant enemies were the cold and the smoke. A narrow slit window loses a lot less heat than a big opening. That's crucial. But it also lets you control the draft. In a room with an open fire, managing airflow is everything. You want to encourage the smoke to go up and out, not pull down where you're trying to breathe. So those little windows were part of a very basic but very clever ventilation system.
And those thick stone or earth walls, they kept the weather out, but they must have created their own kind of cold inside.
They absolutely did. Stone and earth have what's called high thermal mass. They absorb heat very slowly and they release it very slowly. During the day, that's great. It keeps the house cool in summer and buffers it from the worst of the winter chill. But at night, deep into the winter, those walls just keep radiating cold. They never actually feel warm. So you might have the heat from the fire pushing out, but the moment you step away from the hearth, you feel this damp, bone-deep chill coming right back at you from the walls.
And what about the low ceilings? That feels like a very deliberate choice that would have a practical and a psychological effect.
Practically, it's just so much easier to heat a small space. Heat rises, right? So a low ceiling traps that precious warmth down where the people are. It's just simple thermal efficiency. But psychologically, yes, having that low, soot-blackened ceiling pressing down on you, it discourages movement. It encourages you to be still, to conserve energy. It reinforces the whole idea that evening is for quiet, contained activity, not for pacing around.
And because of that need for containment for thermal efficiency, any idea of modern privacy just goes out the window.
Completely. The one main room of the house was the kitchen, the workshop, the living room, the bedroom. It was everything. And at night, all those functions just collapsed into one single purpose: shelter and shared warmth.
The cold floor must have been a constant enemy, just sucking the heat out of everything. How did they fight that?
It was relentless. Cold just rises up from a dirt floor or even from rough wooden planks, so elevation was the key. This is why you see benches, stools, and especially beds raised off the ground. Even getting yourself a foot or two off the floor created a bucker zone that could mean the difference between a miserable, shivering night and a tolerable one. They'd put down rushes of straw on the floor, which helped a bit, but getting your body off the ground was the most effective defense.
With the fire and the drafts and the cold, the house was never truly quiet in a modern sense.
Never. The building itself was always making noise. You couldn't escape it. The wood creaks as it cools down. The thatch roof rustles in the wind. And of course, you had the sounds of animals, mice in the walls, maybe even livestock in an attached section. This wasn't a relaxing silence. It was a textured quiet. And you learned to read those sounds. The normal creaks of the house were a sign that it was alive, that it was holding together around you.
That unavoidable presence, the constant sound and closeness, it means personal boundaries were just completely different. Do the sources talk about the challenge of just having a private thought?
The idea of having a truly private, solitary moment was almost non-existent. You were always within earshot and often within physical touch of other people. It's a profound difference from our lives. That waking period during segmented sleep, which we'll get to, that offered a small window for private reflection, but even then you had to be quiet. There must have been this constant psychological negotiation between the need for communal survival and the complete lack of personal space. It would have required an immense amount of tolerance.
So if firelight was the communal anchor, let's talk about the real measure of wealth and productivity, the candle. The sources are so clear that light was literally money.
Light is money, and it burns incredibly fast. A candle isn't just something you find. It's a manufactured good that requires expensive, time-consuming materials. They were never, ever lit casually. And we have to talk about the huge difference in quality because it's a direct reflection of social class.
All right, there's beeswax, and then there's everything else.
Exactly. Beeswax was the gold standard. It burns clean, it's bright, it has a pleasant, soft honey scent, and it doesn't produce much soot. But producing it is incredibly labor-intensive, so beeswax was astronomically expensive. For a single pound of it, a peasant might have to work for a week or even a month. So it was reserved almost exclusively for the very wealthy, for nobles, and for the church, where the purity of the light had a religious significance.
So if that's what the wealthy had, what was the reality for everyone else?
Everyone else used tallow. Candles made from rendered animal fat, usually from sheep or cows. Tallow is much cheaper, but the drawbacks were intense. It burns unevenly, it drips everywhere, and it produces this thick, greasy, black soot. And most importantly, it stinks. It has this distinct, acrid, fatty smell. That odor would just fill the small room, mixing with the wood smoke and the damp.
And tallow candles weren't just set it and forget it, were they? They required constant maintenance.
Constant vigilance. The wicks weren't braided like modern ones, so they didn't burn down evenly. You had to constantly trim the wick, snuff it to stop it from smoking too much or creating this big mushroom of carbon that would dim the flame. So if you lit a candle, you couldn't just leave it. Someone had to be paying attention to it the entire time.
Which really underlines why they were rationed so carefully. You only burn that resource for specific, necessary tasks.
Exactly. You'd light a candle to mend clothes or maybe to read a very important document if you were literate. For eating, and then you would extinguish it immediately. And they wasted nothing. The little stubs were saved. The dripped wax was scraped up and melted down to be reused. That resource, once it was burned, was gone forever, and that fact shaped all their behavior.
And how did that fragile light affect how people moved? Firelight is broad and dancing. Candlelight must have enforced a different kind of stillness.
That's a great way to put it. Candlelight observes it doesn't dance. Its small, concentrated pool of light encourages you to be still, to make slow gestures. Any sudden movement could make the flame flicker or worse, knock the candle over. So it forced this psychological state of calm, quiet concentration. It made any task done by its light feel like a slow, deliberate ritual.
This brings us to a part of the medieval night that is truly alien to our modern experience. The idea that sleep wasn't one solid block of time. Segmented sleep.
Yes, and the written sources are very clear on this. For centuries, the norm was to sleep in two distinct phases. There was the first sleep, then a waking interval of an hour or more, and then a second sleep. And this wasn't seen as a problem, it wasn't insomnia, it was just how people slept. It was the natural rhythm of the human body when it's not being blasted with artificial light.
Where do we see the evidence for this? How do we know it was so common?
It's everywhere once you know what to look for. It's in legal documents, personal diaries, medical texts, literature. You'll see phrases like, she woke from her first sleep. Court records might mention a crime happening between the two sleeps. It was just a recognized part of the night. What it tells us is that the profound darkness, by allowing the body's natural melatonin production to run its course, let our pre-industrial biorhythms take over. And for many people, that rhythm is biphasic.
So you were just awake in the middle of the coldest, darkest part of the night. What did they do? And did that earlier fear of the dark return?
They were awake, yes. But interestingly, the sources suggest that the sharp-edged fear from the early evening had usually faded by then. The house was secure, the world outside had been quiet for hours, the mind was calmer, and they used that time, quietly but productively. It was a time for prayer or quiet reflection. For couples, it was a time for conversation, for intimacy, a rare moment of privacy. They might do small chores, too, check on the embers of the fire to make sure they hadn't gone out completely. It was this period of forced, quiet clarity with absolutely no external distractions.
It sounds like a psychological reset. The mind turning inward because there's literally nowhere else for it to go.
That's exactly it. With no books to read by a lamp, no screens to stare at, the mind just, the processes. It was a time for reflection, for thinking through problems. And then, as the body cooled down further and the night wore on, drowsiness would gently return and they'd drift off into their second sleep, which would take them through to the dawn.
The sources all note that the cold really makes itself known in those pre-dawn hours, that it creeps in through your ankles and wrists. Surviving the night was a constant battle for warmth.
And the body learns to be efficient. You automatically curl up, you minimize exposed skin, you stop moving. It's instinct. And without modern insulation, the single most effective source of heat was other bodies.
Which brings us to shared beds. The modern idea of privacy just had to take a back seat to the basic physical need for thermal survival.
It absolutely did. It was common for the entire family and sometimes servants or even travelers to share a single large bed or sleeping platform. Empty space in a bed was a thermal liability. Huddling together created pockets of shared body heat that were far more effective than any blanket could be on its own. It was just pure, practical cooperation.
But did that cooperation erase the social order? If a master and a servant were sharing a room or even a sleeping space, was cold the great equalizer, or did hierarchy still matter?
That's a fantastic question, and the answer is that hierarchy almost never disappeared, even in sleep. Cold was the motivator, yes, but wealth still dictated the quality of the sleeping arrangement. A better mattress, more blankets. More importantly, status dictated your position. The head of the household would get the warmest, safest spot furthest from the drafty door. Servants or lower status family members would be on the edges, taking the brunt of the cold. So while they shared body heat, the distribution of comfort still reflected the social order of the day.
And what about the cold tax? This constant, lifelong exposure to cold, did it build resilience or did it just wear people down?
It's a big debate. The human body is incredibly adaptable, but there's no question that chronic cold stress took a heavy toll. You can see it in longevity records, in patterns of illness. Constant exposure to cold, damp air, especially when combined with all that smoke, was terrible for the lungs. Pneumonia, chronic coughs. These were common killers, especially in winter. When you read about people seeing their breath indoors on a winter night, that tells you everything. The cold was never defeated, it was just managed. And that constant cold tax meant aches, pains, compromised immune systems, and lost days of work, which was a disaster in a subsistence economy.
So moving beyond the immediate household, let's look at the lingering threats and the community systems that govern the night, starting with the one that never really went away, fire.
Even when the flames were low, the danger was still there. A single glowing ember buried in the ash can stay alive for hours, a spark can travel silently. And in a medieval town with wooden buildings packed tightly together, a single house fire could become a catastrophe that wipes out the entire community. That awareness was always there.
So the community safeguards, like the curfew, weren't just about stopping crime. They were about fire prevention.
That was their primary purpose. The word curfew itself comes from the Old French couvre-feu, which literally means cover the fire. The law was designed to get people inside, not just for safety, but to reduce the number of open flames torches, lanterns moving around, and to ensure every household was vigilantly watching its own hearth. Towns had watchmen who were looking for smoke as much as they were looking for thieves, and families were required to keep buckets of water ready. Not enough to stop a real blaze, but maybe enough to stop a spark before it could catch. It was a huge, shared responsibility.
We've established that nighttime travel was a last resort. What was the risk calculation if you absolutely had to be out there?
The risk just went up exponentially. You were relying almost entirely on memory and intuition because your senses gave you so little useful information. You were basically entering a void. Your mind fills in the gaps with the worst possibilities. Does that sound an animal? A bandit? A ghost? And your ability to react was crippled. You can't see an attacker, you can't find your footing, your shouts for help might not be heard. For a lone traveler, the night was a zone of extreme risk.
And how would something like a storm amplify that?
A storm at night was terrifying because you lost what little sensory information you had. Wind is howling, making it impossible to hear anything else. Heavy rain makes it impossible to see. Paths turn to mud pits instantly. Even indoors, the sound of the storm was your only guide. You'd listen to the rhythm of the rain on the roof, the pitch of the wind, trying to gauge how bad it was, worrying if the roof was going to hold.
And what about animals? How did they fit into this nocturnal world?
Animals became much more present. At a basic level, rats and mice were bolder at night. They're scurrying a constant background noise. Your own livestock could get spooked in the dark. But domesticated animals were also your best defense. A dog was an incredible early warning system. It would hear or smell a stranger long before a human could. A restless horse could be the first sign that something was wrong outside. They were a crucial part of the home's sensory network.
We've touched on how quiet was a necessity, but it also became a pillar of social order, enforced by law.
Yes, curfews and locked town gates maintained that structure. But the social expectation was silence. Making a lot of noise at night, shouting, singing, wasn't just rude, it was seen as a dangerous disruption. It broke the communal calm that everyone depended on for safety. In that way, quiet was a form of social control.
And let's circle back to a critical point. Darkness wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was profoundly social. It reinforced the massive inequality of the medieval world.
It's one of the starkest examples. Light was the ultimate status symbol. A wealthy home could afford to burn bright, clean beeswax candles, maybe even high-quality lamp oil. They had better homes, sturdier walls, more windows for the daytime. This meant the wealthy could have longer, more productive evenings. They could read, write, do business, entertain. For the poor, darkness meant an absolute end to productive work and confinement in a cold, smoky, crowded space. The darkness was a daily, physical reminder of your place in the world.
And finally, the psychological impact. What happened when someone got sick in the middle of the night, when you were at your most vulnerable and help was furthest away?
Illness always feels worse at night, doesn't it? When you're alone with your thoughts and your pain. In the Middle Ages, that feeling was amplified 1,000 times. The cold, the smoke, it made respiratory illnesses so much worse. And if someone took a bad turn after sunset, the family knew they were completely on their own until morning. So care became this intensely communal, physical thing. Family members would arrange themselves around the sick person, partly to listen to their breathing, but also just to share body heat. The night demanded constant vigilance, and it made everyone acutely aware of just how fragile human life was against the demands of the environment. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, what all these sources really show is that medieval people were not just passive victims of the dark. They didn't conquer the night with technology the way we have. They negotiated with it, one quiet, enclosed, firelit space at a time. And in that negotiation, you see this profound adaptive skill that we've almost completely lost. The lack of sight sharpened every other sense. It prioritized the community's survival over any modern idea of privacy, and it enforced this deep, ingrained patience.
We've seen how darkness shaped their work, their homes, their social rules, and even the fundamental rhythm of their sleep. Vigilance and cooperation weren't just virtues. They were woven into the basic fabric of life. And that skill and adaptation leaves us with a final thought for you. The medieval night was defined by what you could call fragmented sleep, but profound awareness. This hyper-attentiveness born from pure necessity. Which raises a question for our world. In our perpetually bright, constantly distracting age, where we've effectively eliminated true, absolute darkness, what sensory, intellectual, or even social skills have we lost along the way? Something to think about until the sun comes up. Sweet dreams.